God, most merciful, ever merciful, and may God's peace and blessings be upon His holy Prophet Muhammad and the purified members of his household and progeny.
Allahumma salli ala Muhammad wa ali Muhammad.
Brothers, there are no sisters today. Brothers and respected viewers, if there are any, Assalamu alaikum wa rahmatullahi wa barakatuh. And welcome once again to our series, Life, the Islamic Answer. Our last discussion in the general theme of knowledge and reason in Islam had to do with the topic or the theme of within reason and knowledge and rationality in Islam. We were discussing the heading or the topic of the community of knowledge. And we said within that general theme, first we established that in our religion there is importance given to the general topic of the collectivity or the community. And we established this through mainly Quranic teachings, Quranic verses, that show that in our religion it is not only the individual that matters, that we are part of a community or multiple communities. Each one of these communities is distinguished by certain characteristics and features, and we can always choose to belong to such a community or not. And these communities are like concentric circles. So the largest of these communities, for instance, is that we are all human beings. And within that, there are those who believe, for instance, in the scripture or scriptures from Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala, Ahl al-Kitab. And within that, there are those who are Muslims. And within that, and so on and so forth. And so, based on these general principles, we established the notion of a community of knowledge. In the community of knowledge, we said that within the community of knowledge, there can be a number of people who are the, let's say, the obvious components of that community. So we have, for instance, the seeker of knowledge, we have the person who carries the knowledge, the scholar, the teacher. But when we go to the Islamic teachings, we see that there are specific instructions to other categories of people who need to belong to that community. And ultimately, when we went through the narrations, we saw that everyone who is a believer, who has awareness of these types of communities, is supposed to find a place for themselves within the community of knowledge. Even if you are not formally the student or the seeker of knowledge and formally the one who shares that knowledge, you are perhaps the one who listens in on that knowledge, the one who hears that knowledge and follows it to the best of your ability. Or you are the one who sits into these gatherings. Or you are the one who at least loves these gatherings and supports these gatherings one way or another. So ultimately we were saying that anyone who is a believer is supposed to belong to these communities. And then we went a little bit into the how. And we saw that in our religion there is a special emphasis on gatherings. And we went into those details, that these gatherings are to be in person, that they are to be regular and frequent, and that they should be gatherings, specifically gatherings of knowledge. There can be other types of gathering, but there has to be gatherings of knowledge. And we also saw that Ahl al-Bayt alayhim as-salam are saying that these gatherings of knowledge, if they meet the conditions of a gathering of knowledge, these are in fact the gatherings that are bringing to life our affair, bringing to life our matter. And this is something that in our beliefs and in our belief system, we give a lot of importance to. We don't necessarily associate it with the gatherings of knowledge. When we hear Ahyu Amrana or Ihya Amr Ahl al-Bayt alayhim as-salam, we don't necessarily associate it with the gathering of knowledge. But Ahl al-Bayt alayhim as-salam say this is the best way to keep our affair and to keep our remembrance alive is through gatherings of knowledge. We went through a number of other details, but then we went back to the topic of who belongs to that community, and we said that on the side of our religion, we have specific teachings about specific categories of people. Beyond what is mentioned in general in religion, we also may want to look at certain categories of people a little bit more closely because of their importance, because of their relevance to us, because we have questions or because we have issues and matters that we need to get more awareness around and more education around and to think about more seriously within our own communities. One of those groups specifically mentioned in our religion are the youth, children and the youth. And so we spent a little bit of time going through a number of the ahadith and the teachings in our religion and explaining why there is so much importance given to the youth, starting from childhood and onwards, while at the same time emphasizing that this is not to be considered a pretext for someone to say, I did not learn in childhood and early age, therefore, it's too late for me and I should not remain in a state of learning for the rest of my life, for instance. So that was one category. The next category was that of women. And we specifically addressed the topic of women because there are certain misconceptions even within our own communities, depending on the communities that we belong to. There may be misconceptions around the relationship between women and knowledge, specifically in Islam, to the degree that some may think that Islam discourages women from engaging in serious learning and serious seeking of knowledge, including religious knowledge. And so we chose a certain path and a certain way to look at a number of cases to establish that this is not really a valid argument. It cannot be said by anyone, cannot be claimed by anyone who understands Islamic history, especially since, the past centuries after the early times of Islam. And we specifically and intentionally stayed away from the household of the Holy Prophet and the household of the Imams, peace upon them all, so that the argument does not go in the direction of these are special people, these are people who have access to special types of knowledge, we don't really compare to them. We specifically went to people that we consider ordinary enough, similar enough to us, with the only distinction that we focused on the families and the households of scholars. Because we said they happen to be much more documented in terms of lives and biographies than others, and that is supposed to be the model to be followed. So if those families and those households give us the indication or clearly explain that, we should, with all of our understanding of religion, stay away or keep our women away from seeking a higher or advanced level of education and knowledge in Islam, then that gives us a very good, strong argument in the direction that these misconceptions are going, which is women are to stay away or are discouraged from seeking religious education or advanced levels of knowledge and so on and so forth. And we saw the exact contrary to that. Enough examples, and we said these are simply samples, but they are very telling of that type of environment, that type of world, and the thinking and worldview of these types of people. The next category that we wanted to look at is the family. Now, and here I want to be very clear that we are not talking about the family as in the importance of the family in Islam. We're not talking about the holiness and sanctity of the family in Islam. We're not talking about how our religion says to establish a family or the teachings specifically around the family. This is not what we're talking about. We are still within the heading of the community of knowledge. And we're going through a few categories that have been identified in Islamic teachings as being the main constituents, the main components and ingredients of a community of knowledge. We said there is the seeker of knowledge, the learner, there is the teacher, there is the youth or the children. Specifically, we addressed women because there are misconceptions around them. There are a couple of categories left that we want to spend a bit more time on, and then we'll move on from that whole notion of the community of knowledge. After, as we said, we want to look maybe at the characteristics and the benefits and what to expect from such communities. We'll move on to the types of knowledge that Islam encourages. The reason we're talking about the family is specifically from the point or from the angle or the perspective that it is an ingredient or a component or an agent of a community of knowledge. This is what we're focusing on. And this in itself, as a topic, we could spend a long time on this topic of family, depending on the interest, depending on what we want to discuss and how far we want to go into this at this time. And the reason I mentioned this is that, as we promised earlier in the series, there will inshallah be an entire theme in the life series dedicated to the family, as we will move away from the individual towards the society. One of the main themes is going to be the family, what makes up the family, and every topic that we could think of associated with that general theme of the family. So we are going to go in depth into the topic of family later as a standalone theme in this life series. So inshallah, all of this will be delved in much more detail. At this time, we're just focused on maybe providing some connecting the dots, some reminders and refreshers about what we have said until now, and things that we have discussed even outside of this series specifically, because we have talked about the topic of the family in multiple different formats and from different angles. We'll try to bring it together here simply to reconnect with the topic of the community of knowledge in Islam. So for today, given this introduction and what I'm trying to do, I'm not going to go into the texts themselves, and then afterwards we'll see. If there is interest in going into some of the texts or samples of the texts, we can do that in the next lecture. Otherwise, I'm not planning on spending too much time more on the topic of the family as an ingredient, as a component of the knowledge community beyond what we're covering today. We're simply putting some, main signposts, nothing more than that, to keep it in mind until we come back to this topic a little bit later in the series. So as we said, generally speaking, it should not be a surprise to anyone that in our religion there is a lot of importance given to, I can't use words that are strong enough to explain the importance that our religion has given to family, to the structure of the family, to the teachings around the family, and so on and so forth. In the past, the terminology that I have used is that there is holiness and sanctity around the notion of family in Islam. And what follows, there are teachings that follow. These teachings are therefore going to fall in the category of rituals. They become acts of worship. And there are too many examples to list, and we're not going to go into that. But this is the first layer that we should keep in mind. So inshallah, this is the first introduction. The second point, or the second introductory point related to this, is therefore, if we want to move to the topic of knowledge communities specifically, why are we talking about the family? Why are we spending time on the family itself? And in short, the claim is that it is very improbable, very difficult, or we don't want to say impossible, it is very improbable or very difficult to have people, individuals, who will end up belonging to a community of knowledge, to an Islamic community of knowledge, in the sense that we have explained and will explain in the next few lectures, without having the support and infrastructure that is provided by a strong system of families behind it. This is what we're trying to establish. The reason why we're talking about the family within the topic of the community of knowledge, or the Islamic community of knowledge specifically, is that the main generator of these communities of knowledge is the family. There's a family structure that is producing individuals who naturally end up belonging to this community of knowledge. Otherwise, we're not saying it's impossible, we're saying it's a lot more work, and therefore a lot more improbable, a lot more difficult to end up with Islamic communities of knowledge if you do not have the Islamic teachings that are producing the right families to start with. There's a lot more work to do. It may take a lot longer. It may take generations more. And a lot more individual effort going against what you were initially taught. Undoing a lot of the teachings that you got. All of this because the family structure did not enable you. But if the family structure is there, you will be naturally pushed towards this, and it will naturally produce Islamic communities of knowledge. That's the claim. And that's why we're talking about the notion of the family. Now, the topic of the family in Islam and how it is an ingredient or a component of an Islamic community of knowledge, we could talk about it in a much more theoretical sense. We could say, in general, we present an Islamic theory around all of this, and it becomes much more theoretical in general, which is not what I'm going to be doing. We may do a little bit more of that when we get to the theme of the family in Islam. And that is very valid and very important and relevant. But we don't have time, and we're trying to keep things moving. The additional layer to the general principles that are valid and universal and timeless and always applicable is when we apply them to our own specific circumstances today. What kind of world do we live in? What kind of society do we live in? To see, perhaps in another world, in another context, in another culture, in another point in history, perhaps the ingredient of the family as an agent, as an ingredient in the making of Islamic communities of knowledge, perhaps at another time or in other circumstances would not be so important. It would still produce people who are going to be part of those communities, but it is not as important as today's world. And in our specific circumstances, social, cultural circumstances. Why? In short, and this is something that we have discussed in the past, so I don't want to spend too much time on it, but I do want to kind of provide a high-level overview, is that the notion, the idea of the family is in crisis. And the attack against the family as a structure and as an idea, as a social structure, and even as an idea and a notion, has been so strong and so relentless that it has completely destabilized and made it even very difficult to want to go towards the notion of the family, to establish a family, to live in a family life. This is the current reality. This is the current context in which we're living. So, if we look at the idea of the crisis of the family, and this is a notion that is not Islamic specifically, by the way. In fact, a lot of Islamic thinkers have not addressed this notion directly. There are a lot more thinkers in the West who have talked about this. The crisis of the family, the war against the family, the disintegration of the family, and they have been writing about this for decades now. Many of them sociologists and thinkers who have studied this notion and understood or tried to unearth a lot of the repercussions of the disintegration of the family in society. What does it lead to? What are the repercussions that society is headed towards structures where the traditional structure of the family is no longer present, or no longer the main way in which people come into society? Okay, so I wanted to go over a few points related to that quickly. The first notion, and this is a whole theme that inshallah we'll come back to later in the series, we'll talk about it a little bit more, is that generally speaking, over the past 2 centuries or so, perhaps a little bit more than 2 centuries, there's been a steady movement away from religion representing a lot of what is considered to be the traditional values in society. There has been a steady movement away from what is traditional values, or what today in a lot of ways is called conservative values, conservative teachings, a conservative worldview. The family is at the center and at the core of this. And so this has also meant a steady movement away from religion. And this is well known, well documented, and this inshallah is something we will study in a lot more detail and a lot more depth later in the series. As part of this movement though, there has been a counter movement very recently. If we look at over 2 centuries, 2.5 centuries, we see that the general tendency has been to move away from religion, away from traditional values, away from traditional structures in society. But in very, very recent times, there has been a counter movement to start going back towards traditional values, including the family. That said, and as I said, I don't want to spend too much time on this, I just want to add one thing, which is this return is not a return to what existed before this movement. We're not going back to the same understanding of the family or the same understanding of religion or the same understanding of the traditional values as we had 2 or 3 centuries ago. Of course not. Too much has happened. You can never go back to that. You can go back to a new version of that as you understand it today. You return back to a traditional form and traditional values and structures, whether it's religion or family or other realities, social realities, but it is not the same ones that existed before. And this is an important point that I'm not addressing now, but we have to keep in mind. Okay? So this is one point. In another way to keep in mind, what we are returning to is, if we're saying is that it's not the same as, in a lot of ways we're perhaps returning only partially. And for the rest of it, there are things that are changing. We're not accepting everything that we accepted before, or we're accepting it with qualifiers, with things that modify it. Okay? We know too much, we learn too much, there are lessons learned, so on and so forth. For all sorts of good and bad reasons, we're not returning to the exact same thing as we had before. And this is an important point. For people who are thinkers and researchers, it means that whatever we're returning to is not something stable that we can all point directly to and we say, this is what we're returning to. That needs to be created, that needs to be thought about, that needs to be revised or reviewed, transformed, adapted to today's world, whatever that may be. Okay, that's a point. Second point, the attacks on the family may be direct or indirect. And this is important to keep in mind because at times we may simplify the equation, simplify the reality, and only focus on perhaps direct attacks. And those are much more obvious. If someone comes out and says, I do not believe that the structure of the family as we know it, what used to be called or is called the nuclear family, the structure of the nuclear family, that's not good. Let's say someone goes that far to say, this is not even good for society, we have to go against that. We have to revise it and come up with something different, or encourage something different, or fight it even. That would be a direct attack, and all of us would know exactly what the attack looks like, what is it leading to, and then look at the domino effect of that. But there are indirect ways of attacking the family, and these are many, and they go very deep. And in a lot of cases, they require a lot more awareness, or a lot more education, a lot more sensitivity to what is actually going on, in order to see that there is a connection between this and the structure of the family, the importance of the family, the relevance of the family in the world and in our lives. Indirectly, for instance, it should be undeniable to all of us, anyone who is exposed to mass culture, the general tendencies, cultural tendencies of today, that there is, and this is indirect, no one may be telling you this directly to your face, encouraging you. There is a general discouragement to go towards the family structure. That should be undeniable. There is a constant questioning of the model of the nuclear family, The structure of that family, the purpose of that family, the relevance of that family, all of that is constantly questioned. There is questioning around whether this is the right thing to do, to even move towards creating that structure, that social structure. Should you even think about, finding yourself a spouse, starting a family, having children? Should you even be thinking about that? When at other points in history this would never have been, could have been a topic for discussion. Nothing could be more natural than to move in that direction and to simply follow those steps as the normal steps in a human being's life. Today, all of this is being questioned. Should you get married? Should you have family? Should you have children? And underlying a lot of this, there are connections to be made, which we're not going to make here. Inshallah, to all of you, or many of you, these are clear. Inshallah, we will expose and talk about and present and study and analyze these in much more depth later. Very clear, let's call them cultural. They are not cultural, but let's simplify it and call them cultural tendencies. One of them, for instance, being individualism. We are in a society that pushes the individual, the happiness of the individual, the importance of the individual. It's all about you. Self this and self that. It's all about self. You matter more than anyone else. Even if that other is a child, or a spouse, or a father, or a sibling, or a member of a community. Your happiness, your luxury, your comfort, your mental state, your self-well-being, and so on and so forth, trumps everything else. This is the general culture. Anything that goes against that, you're going against the grain. You're going against the current. It's an uphill battle. There are sacrifices, and we're not sure that those sacrifices are worth it. This is what this culture tells you. Make sure they're really worth it, that you're very comfortable making those sacrifices. So of course, when you come from a background where you had traditional values and traditional teachings, even if you are not coming from an Islamic background, and people who have done the studies, they know this. There are studies upon studies. In Canada, for instance, there are studies that looked at, if you study the not-for-profit and charity sector, there are studies that show that today, a lot of people depend on people's charities in order to live, or live a little bit better. Why? Because socially, your charity and the work that not-for-profits does and so on and so forth is replacing what used to be performed by family and neighborhood functions. There used to be a church that brought people together. Everybody knew everyone because it was a smaller town. If someone is missing because they are sick or they are needy or suddenly they can no longer work, people realize, they come together as a community, they help the person. This is generally speaking how Canada worked for a very long time. This is not a function that a state has to come in and intervene. It's grassroots. It's based on your values from within you. Because of your belief system. And I mentioned church. Because of your belief system. You want to help. You feel that that is part of what you do. And you even think if it's purely utilitarian, as they say, you're also thinking, well, maybe something will happen to me tomorrow. Of course I have to help the others. So that if I need help, the others are going to step in and help me. Or because this is the right thing to do. Or this is, what would Jesus do? Whatever you want to call it. This used to be part of the social fabric. When all of that suddenly goes away, for all sorts of reasons, when all of that goes away, now the state has to intervene and take care of that person because there's no more any social structure to support the person who suddenly goes missing. Because they haven't gone missing. Because everybody is living their individualistic life. There is no community or neighborhood or society where that person is suddenly missing. Okay, so you're not showing up for work. Go ahead and apply for insurance. There's employment insurance for that. It's no longer a neighborhood or a community function to ask and to see or
the family support system to step in. And in fact, the culture has moved in the direction where you hit a certain age, you should leave. And if you don't, you're kind of a loser. Because it means that you didn't develop enough of your social skills to be able to live independently on your own. Which is the opposite of what you have in traditional societies, where if you move, it is shameful. It means you've abandoned your family when it is time for you to step in and start helping in your family. It's turned upside down. And there are many, many contributing factors to this. So that's one portion of it, one angle. And then there's the consumption society that falls into all of this and contributes to all of this. And of course, in order, the more you consume, the more resources you need. And perhaps if you live on one income, it becomes very difficult. So you need two incomes so that you can consume more. And consumption generally is going to lead to hyperconsumption, which is something that in the past should last you 10 years or 15. Today it should last you maybe 6 months or 1 year. And then it needs to be replaced. Because culturally it needs to be replaced. And we're in fact going to produce something that will not last more than 8 months or 2 years. Because that's the tendency. And it's a consumptionist society. Of course it's not going to last. It's not meant to last. It used to be meant to last. It was designed to last and never failed. If it fails in 2 years, there's a problem. Everybody would say there's a problem. Today, if it fails, it's okay, well, that's it. It's very normal. We move on and we just replace without even, batting an eye, as they say. In any case, and then you associate with that, material success has always been important for human beings. But it was not as important as it is today. Because every other type of success is following by the wayside. So what keeps taking over more and more space is going to be material success. There are other forms of success in life. Even by life standards. It used to matter a lot more whether you have a successful family structure. Whether that's worth something or not. Today it's not really that important. And if you don't, it doesn't matter. So there is no push. Nothing encourages you. If you want to, great, go ahead. If you don't want to, that's fine too. So this is all part of the social circumstances and the social fabric and general culture. Then you have the direct attacks on the family. And as we said, those are a lot more obvious. There are the conceptual attacks. So the notion of the family itself needs to be revised. Why do we have this function called family or called nuclear family? Made up traditionally, historically, of a man and a woman who start having children, and that constitutes your nuclear family, and then you have indirectly everyone around that. You go up one generation, you go sideways with the siblings and the in-laws and the children, and then all of those people stay connected, and that performs a function in society. All of that is being questioned today. That doesn't really mean as much as it used to before. And why should we keep that structure? What really is the function of that? We don't really need it. We can come up with alternative structures, and they perform as good, if not better, a function in society. And then practically speaking, so this is at the notional level, and then practically speaking, well, the policies are changing, the laws are changing, so there are actual changes in society. This is not just at a practical, only at a theoretical, conceptual level. Practically speaking, things have changed on the ground. You cannot just talk about this as ideas for you and I to think about and discuss. The laws have changed. The policies have changed. So when we look at the structure of the family, to the extent that it exists today, it is in much more danger, at risk, much more vulnerable than it has been in the past. If we start looking at the history, let's say especially in the West, but I'm going to get to how this is now a world event. This is a world reality. It's not the West. And I know, I'm very aware that It's very problematic to talk about the West. That's always an issue. But generally speaking, everybody understands what we mean by the West, so that's what I'm using. Inshallah, in the future, we'll detail it with all the nuances that are required to show that there are plural Wests. But for the time being, let's call the West. Especially in the West, there has been a clear movement from, especially, the Industrial Revolution, all the way to, which led to globalization and today's world. This has been a very clear movement. And the main driver behind it, or the main lens through which you should look at it, should be an economic lens. Ultimately, it's about financial development and economic development of states, societies and states. But this has had huge ramifications on every aspect of society. And that's why they say we are moving from an age to another age, from a phase in history to another phase in history, because that movement has happened. It's not simply looking at an economic structure. We're not just looking at, industrial, mechanical tools or technologies, or it goes way beyond, to the point where you have to revise something like the structure of a family. As a result of this movement from the Industrial Revolution all the way to globalization. The last versions of this movement, the last chapters of this movement, led to what is called modernity, and then everything that has happened since modernity. Because there are those thinkers who say we are still in modernity, and there are those who say we have moved away from into post-modernity. And there's a big thinker, he's probably one of the best known thinkers because of how much time he has spent thinking about this and writing about this. He calls it liquid modernity. Zygmunt Bauman, his name. He talks about liquid modernity, and he says it's different from post-modernity and it's different from modernity. And the idea is simply that, and this is the distinguishing feature, whatever you want to call it, the distinguishing feature is that's why he calls it liquid modernity. There is nothing stable anymore. No matter where you look, you used to have solid structures, fixed realities, truths that people believed in. And now when you look, you see that there is nothing stable anymore. Everything's liquid, everything's fluid, everything's flexible, unstable, in movement. Today it's this, tomorrow it's something different. It's a sliding scale. It may not even exist. It may exist in a different form. So this creates all sorts of issues. And these issues are psychological, because this creates an anxiety in people that you no longer have any truth to stand on. And this becomes a lot more manifest when you go through a crisis in life. If you're going through the motions and you're not really aware of what's going on, you don't really realize it. But as soon as you go through something in life where you suddenly remember what is the meaning of this, and you say, but there is no meaning, because everything is in flux and everything is liquid and there's nothing stable. There's no God, there's no family, there's no religion, there's no church, there's no state, there's no truth. Truth is whatever you want it to be and whatever I want it to be. And I have my truth and you have your truth. And I have to respect your truth and you have to respect my truth. And that's it. So where's the meaning? There's no meaning. You can create your own meaning, but if you create your own meaning, you know that you just created that meaning. Can you really stand on it? Does it really give you meaning for your life? Or does it create crisis and anxiety? And people living constantly in that search for something more. And there are a lot of studies around that. And hence the return that I mentioned a little bit before. Hence the return to religion and the return to religious values, because they've looked everywhere and they say the crisis just keeps growing. We need to turn back. At some point we took a wrong turn as a society. We need to start turning back to some things that were providing more happiness. So in any case, people are a lot more exposed to destabilizing beliefs.
destabilizing values. Everything is in flux. And this applies to ethnicity, this applies to religion, beliefs, even socioeconomic classes. And as we said, even at the psychological level and at the intellectual level, this has now created, once again, an individualistic society. You and I used to share the same truths, the same notions. We were part of a community of believers, or we were part of a neighborhood, and everybody kind of believed the same thing. Today, you're stuck in your own head and your own world, and I am stuck in my own head and my own world. If I have bought into, to the extent that I have bought into this individualistic way of living, everybody is stuck as an individual, or the idea that every human being is an island, right? You're an island. You're not connected to anything and anyone. You're stuck in your own head. In philosophy, they used to call it solipsism. Your reality is stuck. You will never know if others believe or can even understand what you're talking about, because what's in your head is in your head, and what's in theirs is theirs, if they even exist. Right? That's the idea of the solipsism. So that's a form of that. In any case, so this has had a direct impact on living with other human beings. And earlier in the series, we talked about a notion. I didn't want to turn it too philosophical. We kept it very practical. We talked about the art of listening. But the art of listening has deep ramifications to how do you live with other human beings. Can you really hear them? Can you really listen to them when you live in that type of society? Completely individualistic, hyper-consumerist. Do you really have time? Especially if they differ with you in how they think and how they approach the world, which becomes a challenge when you live in a family. Because if you're an individual and all that matters is how you view the world and how you want to live your world and your life, it's a challenge for you to go and truly listen to that other person you're living with. It's not easy. Fundamentally, women and men think very differently. They approach issues very differently. You have to kind of go out of your way of thinking and seeing the world if you want to really listen to the other. This type of society is not conducive to that, does not encourage that, does not enable that. It teaches you to be impatient and close the door and move on. I don't need this. Because it's individualistic. If you go back to focus Islamic teachings, it's the opposite. Go towards the other. Open up, or today what they call empathy. See how the other might view the world in a very different way than yours. That's also a valid way of seeing the world. Not only your way is the valid way of seeing the world. You grow by doing that. You sacrifice by doing that, and that's a rewarded sacrifice. In any case. Then we combine all of this with, in very, very recent times, and I've talked about this in the past, I don't want to dwell on it. One of the main features is the absolutely irrational pace, incomprehensible pace of the acceleration of the change that is happening. Things that took decades or centuries to happen in the past, at a large scale, at a grand scale, at a social scale, are now happening in matters of a couple of years, a few months, a few weeks, a few days. The world changes. And a very large part of this, a very large driver of this today is social media. This is what's allowing all of this to happen. And for the 99% of us who are overexposed to social media, exposed to unhealthy dosages of social media, this generates yet more problems that all work against the family and the structure of the family and the idea of the family. And there are two main problems with this. There are many, many others, but there are two main problems. One problem is that as you are watching all of this and being exposed to what social media is bringing to your attention, and I've talked in the past about the attention economy, what is bringing to your attention, it gives you the impression that this is how the world lives. This is the type of information that you're being exposed to. And you see that it's the same trend or the same idea, the same trope, as they call it, the same theme, the same reality. It just keeps coming back again and again and again ad nauseum. So of course, this gives you the impression that this is how the majority of people think. This is how the majority of the people are living. I'm the one who's the exception. I'm the weirdo. I'm standing out. Of course, this makes you question. And the truth is, this is not how others think. What you get from social media is not representative of the majority of society. Sociological studies can show this, but who has time for that? When you have at your fingertips Instagram and TikTok and Facebook and whatever it's feeding you, this must be the truth because 99% of the people believe this, right? Because 99% of what you're seeing is this. No. There are a few influencers, and that's why they're called influencers. And there are those who copy the influencers because they got influenced. And the copying gets copied. And this is how the algorithms work. And this is what you're exposed to. And you end up thinking that the majority of people think this. When if you were to do a study, an objective sociological study, maybe 20% of the people believe this. The 80% are not represented by what you're getting. It's not meant to represent what is out there. That's not the point of the social media. But you think that this is how the majority of people think, which of course is going to influence how you think. That's one. And two, the reality of social media is a make-believe reality. And I don't think I need to tell you or remind you of the stories. It's no different than watching a movie. It may be true, it may not be. It's an act. You do whatever you need to do. A lot of what is out there is to get a click or a like or a bit of money or. It doesn't necessarily mean that this is what people actually believe. It doesn't necessarily mean that this is how people actually live. But this is what you keep getting bombarded with. And then, given the volume, of course you go back to questioning yourself. Questioning what was supposed to be traditional, before, pre-social media. Pre-whatever trend you're looking at, or trope, or theme that is being pushed today, because tomorrow it might be something else. When you combine these with what we're saying, then you clearly see that social media plays a huge role in accelerating everything else that we were talking about. The constant questioning and bombardment of what we're talking about. The notion of the family, the structure, at the practical level, at the notional level, and so on and so forth. And then by the way was that if you go to actual studies, so today, to take this as an example, as a case in point, depending on what you look at on social media, generally speaking, there is a push against the structure of the family. It discourages from moving in that direction. And the move towards is either falling in the reaction, and there is a reaction, but the reaction is very clearly labeled, so you have to accept the label. That we are going back towards conservative values. There's a switch. There's a U-turn that happened, and I am part of that U-turn. I don't think it should apply to us. But now we have to be labeled this or that. If you accept this narrative and if you accept this reality, you're being forced one way or the other. You're either moving with the liberal stream or you're moving with the conservative stream. And now you're making a U-turn and a comeback. And usually the comebacks are not towards Islamic values and teachings. And that's why it's full of all sorts of distortions. The comeback is not bringing you back to pure Islamic teachings and this is what the Quran says. And when it is, it's I pick and choose. This works, this doesn't, I don't talk about that, I talk about this. In any case. So, this is what you're being fed. This is what you're being exposed to through social media. But does everyone say this? No. If you go back to expert opinion, expert research, let's say sociologists, studies upon studies in the world, they all repeat. Today, culture tells you, culture discourages you from moving towards family and family structure and sacrificing for the family and living in a family structure and so on and so forth. The studies of the experts, they go in the other direction. And these studies have been going on for decades, for generations, and they continue until today. And they all go in the same direction. When they perform studies on individuals, and when they perform studies on societies, generally speaking, people are always happier being in a family structure than not. So it is not true, regardless of what you're being told. The objective studies, the university studies, the studies of experts all around the world, in every society, they all move in the same direction. All things being equal, a human being is much happier in a family structure than not. Even though there might be sacrifices, even though there might be more expenses, even though. Generally speaking, you are much happier. It gives you much more meaning in your life. Throughout your life, it gives you much more happiness, much more stability, much more internal peace to live in a family structure than not. And this is just to give an example. That if you get sucked into general culture, you go down a path that is definitely contradicted by the research. But no one is going to have time to bring the research in this crazy pace of change and pace of social media. To actually slow down and use your critical mind and go to objective studies and what the experts say and compare. What does it say about individuals specifically? Or is a society, forget the individual, generally speaking, which is our theme, we're focused on the community. We want to build a community. Is a society better off when there are families and family structures and solid families within it, or not? What does it lead to when there is this strength, this family strength in a society? And you see the levels of education, you see the socioeconomic development, you see the stability, you see the rates of crime, you see. By every indicator, you see that society is doing much better. If there is a strong infrastructure and a strong family support behind it. In any case. So that was supposed to be the introduction. The second part, we ran out of time, so I'm going to stop here. The second part was simply going to be providing a very quick overview of, therefore, keeping this in mind, and this was simply to highlight the fact that we cannot ignore, if we're really talking about community in general in Islam, or specifically Islamic communities of knowledge, we cannot ignore the notion of the family. We have to say something about families. Even if our religion had not said anything about it, this is something we would have to bring up ourselves because of the context in which we're living today. Either this is something that matters or not. Either we follow the current trends and the general movement of society, or we have to intentionally, deliberately plan to move, to make decisions, to place ourselves, to position ourselves so that we are not simply engulfed or taken over by the current trends. So inshallah, when we continue the discussion, it will simply be a quick reminder or quick overview of what Islam has said about the family structure. even if we start, there are many, many different ways we can do this. I was mainly going to focus on the life of a human being, from conception to death, from the point of view of a family, and to see very high level, generally speaking, some of the teachings of Islam around it. And this, in turn, is meant to keep us on the path of making sure that we don't forget that one of the main ingredients of the Islamic community of knowledge has to be the family. We have to force it. If it's not happening by itself, we have to go out of our way to make sure that one of the main ingredients, one of the main components of the Islamic community of knowledge is the family. Just as important as the learner or the teacher or women and children, specifically the family has to be present as a family unit. There has to be a plan, there has to be a strategy, there has to be thinking around the idea of the family given what we have talked about today. So inshallah we'll continue the next time, and then I'll ask you guys whether you want to discuss any of this in more detail right now, or we simply keep it until we get to the theme of the family where we plan to go into much more depth in all this. وصلى الله على سيدنا محمد وعلى آله الطيبين الطاهرين.
اللهم صل على محمد وآل محمد.
We have the, so it's a little tricky to word it, but like we're talking about going back to a certain phase, but not really going back and creating something new. And I'm assuming that's something new because we didn't really get into it, but it's creating knowledge families, let's say, which means if I've learned anything from your lectures is it means the establishment of the family has to be, or should be, a very intentional process to create that piece of the society that creates that knowledge family, that contributes to the knowledge community, and so on and so forth.
So you want the punchline right now? Yes, so the idea would be that if we want to move towards Islamic communities of knowledge, then we have to have Islamic families. And given today's world, Islamic families are not just going to happen by themselves on their own. They're going to require intentional or deliberate planning and decisions and strategies so that they are created and preserved and fostered and so on. And so
it's not enough to just look the part and follow the rituals. There's more to it.
So we're not going to say how. We can't go into the how. But we're going to say, here are some important Islamic teachings that we were given to help us determine the how. That's all we're trying to do. Otherwise, the how would be, going through every aspect of family life in Islam, and that's not meant to be what we're doing.
I guess awesome. So you said that over the past 2 centuries, that's when we kind of started moving away from traditional values. But what do you think are the major drivers? Like what led to that type of movement? And do you think that they planned for it to be as destructive as it is today? Or do you think that just kind of happened by accident?
There's no answer to this. I can tell you what are the general theories for the answer to this, depending on which school of thought you follow. And it's a very deep question, very important question. Generally speaking, around the 1790s and afterwards, in a lot of the literature and a lot of the analysis, you have to look at Europe as being a standalone entity. And that should have been that. It should have been, this is what has happened in the history of Europe, and no one cares outside of Europe. Because something else completely different was happening, let's say, in China, and something completely different was happening in Africa and the Middle East and South America. Right? So Europe was going through its own crisis, and then the French Revolution happens at the political level. And there are things happening or brewing and boiling at the philosophical and theological level Because, when they overthrow the French Revolution, overthrowing your monarchy, which is intertwined with your church. Okay, so all of this is collapsing. And at the same time, you have economic drivers and the Industrial Revolution coming into play. That should all be just in Europe. But the problem is this got exported to the whole world. And that's the importance of understanding that this got globalized. So the new ideology of, at the same time as Nietzsche and Kant and others who are exporting this thought, they call it the lights, right? This is the revolution. So God is dead, as Nietzsche writes. There's no more religion. There's no more right and wrong. There's no more morality. We are going to create, moving towards modernity, we are going to create our truths. Nothing outside. The human being is now going to become God. And this is exactly how it was presented. Down with the king, down with God, down with everything that used to be the stable structure of your belief system, of your social system, and so on and so forth. We're going to replace that with everything that matters happens in this world, and the center of everything is the human being. So it's a materialistic world with a human being at the center, and the driving force and the way you get to anything is science. And that's the light or the illumination of Kant. This is the new trio or triad. This leads to modern times. Depending on who you are, the popular version of history is that all of this was being driven by economic development. People, so long as they are happy and prosperous economically, they do not revolt, and they do not bring down systems, and they do not tear down social fabrics, and so on and so forth. So this means that there's a lot of poverty and a lot of social injustice and then there is the promise of economic development and prosperity. And so this becomes the dominant narrative in the world. Capitalism, Marxism, the reason why they're supposed to be economic theories. They became entire worldviews. Everything was now explained through an economic model. So those people are going to tell you that the economic development led to new ideologies to emerge in the world. Not because anyone pre-planned it that way. This is just how things evolved. And there's also the counter-argument that it's not the economic development that leads to new ideology. It's not. The ideology is leading to an economic development. You have to you have to tear down those systems so that you live a prosperous life. Which, by the way, is what was presented in a very, very influential work. Inshallah, one day we'll talk about it in much more detail. The End of Times, The Last Man and the End of Times of Fukuyama. Where he talks basically about humanity having reached its last version or most evolved version by creating a capitalistic system politically based on a democracy. And so this is the last stretch of humanity. There is no more evolution after this. The only thing left for capitalism and democracy to do is to destroy the competing systems, Islam being the main one, by the way, as he writes, and he was writing in the 1990s, China being the other. Okay, and it's a very influential book, generated a tremendous amount of scholarship and reactions and so on and so forth. And these two books go together and they are reacting to each other. One of them, Samuel Huntington, was the teacher and the student. And the teacher wrote a book in response to it called The Clash of Civilizations. And in a lot of ways they match, they're aligned. And in a lot of ways they completely stand against each other in what they're saying. But in any case, so you have differing theories on, was the point to change the world, or did the world end up being changed? Okay, so let's go with the easier version and say, no, the world simply ended up being changed. All of this are blind reactions. No one is pre-planning for this. We're just going along. We're reacting to things happening politically, economically, technologically, and we're just making decisions and going along. And we end up, suddenly you wake up after the fact and it's like, oh, we completely destroyed that whole structure. And now we only realize it because we're living through the consequences of having destroyed that structure. So that's the, if you want to remove the evil planning, if you want to remove the conspiracy theory, if you want to remove and make it simpler, that works fine. Let's simply say these are blind results of blind actions that were taken by human beings who are simply trying to find the most prosperous, best way for themselves to live. And this is where they ended up. And this is why they're turning now. They're saying, okay, this is not working, let's try something different. And inshallah one day, and it is part of the plan of the series, when we're going to talk about the types of knowledge, one of the types of knowledge, and I know there was a lot of interest, one of the types of knowledge was supposed to be to understand the world in which we live. And part of that means we understand the place of religion in this world. Does religion still exist in today's world? Because the general conception or misconception is that religion has been wiped out unless you're kind of a fanatic, crazy nutcase who's ideologically conservative and inclined and you refuse to evolve and, like Muslims, for instance. You're hardcore conservative, you don't want to... What about everyone else? So if you do studies, you see that there's a lot more religion today than before. But people are not necessarily turning back, and this was my point at the beginning, they're not necessarily turning back to traditional religion. They turn to new forms of spirituality without going back to religion, because in their minds, we learned our lesson, we're never going back to institutionalized religion. We never want to go back to something that looks like the church. We never want to go back to something where you're prescribed and suddenly you end up with witch hunts and the earth is flat, and if you don't believe that the earth is flat, then we're going to kill you. We're never going back to that. So then it becomes much more spiritualistic and much more individualistic, and so in line with today's culture, but still spiritual. And when we look at the family, for instance, in Islam, the same thing is going to apply. So now and this is the reality, is that you're in a world and you have to adapt whatever you want to go to. It has to work for the circumstances you're in, the reality you're in. You live at a certain time in history. You don't live 2 centuries ago, you live today. So whatever format of family you want to come up with has to work for today. And this becomes a challenge for Islam and every other religion. But we believe Islam is the only one, and we can prove it, that has the potential to find a solution. And the different schools of thought in Islam, and I'm not talking about Sunni, Shia, or Mu'tazili, Ash'ari. I'm talking about the general epistemology of these schools, the theories of knowledge of these schools, how they view what changes and how to deal with it, are going to take very different positions. A school that says the truths of Islam that existed 14 centuries ago have to be taken back as they were and reapplied today, that's one version and one solution. And the other extreme is the school that says Islam never told you this is exactly how you have to do anything. Islam gave you general principles that you can apply to every time and every circumstance. So on one side, they tell you have to still wear the thawb that was worn by the Arabs 14 centuries ago, and if you do not, then you're not really a Muslim. You have to eat like them. You cannot brush your teeth with a toothbrush. You have to use a siwak. Not because it has health benefits or not, regardless of that discussion. Because they did that, this is what we have to go to. This is the only reality and truth that can live in any world to be Islamic. In any world, in any circumstance. You go back, you look backwards, you look back in history to find the truth, you take it as is and you apply it here. And the other extreme, we're both wrong, the other extreme is all of this, whatever was there, we don't care about the external appearance and details. There's behind it a core of truth, a principle behind it. That's the principle that we're after. We want to find that principle and apply it, no matter what it looks like externally, so long as we agree that that was the principle driving it. Islam says stay clean, so long as you're staying clean, it's all good. Even the notion of tahara. Right? It's no longer a blind ritual. Everything is hyper-rationalized. And you have a principle that you can apply and say, that's it, that's all you need to do. And this way I can adapt my religion to every circumstance, no matter how the world changes. And inshallah, we believe we're somewhere in the middle. Because we believe that our religion has told us these things are the fixed truths that are timeless and universal, and these things are the general principles that it's up to you to apply depending on your circumstances. In any case, I don't know if I answered your question.
Very detailed answer.
Okay.
There's a, I mean, like we can see it in a very dark way in terms of where we are and where we're going. It can also be looked at in a, I guess, a positive sense in terms of, like, for every action there's a reaction, which made that, which led us to today, and which is causing another reaction to build, let's say, more. We have the ability now, or the necessity to build more robust and better families than we even had before to combat. Also, it's a heavy task too. So,
and the short answer, I want to say a lot.
That way,
yes, I want to say a lot here. In the philosophy of history, there's a trend that says, history is cyclical.
Yes.
But there's also a trend that believes that history is always moving towards what's better. Regardless of what it looks like in appearance, it's always headed towards improvement. It's an upward evolution.
Yeah.
Okay, and different thinkers had, like Hegel believed in that.
Yeah.
Others believed in a cyclical, and others believed that we're always going in decline.
Yeah.
A Salafist will always tell you that we're always, and that's why we have to go back and recreate what was there before.
Yes.
What was there before was the best version.
Yeah.
And every day we're getting away, we're declining.
Yeah.
Okay, these are
Stuck in
different
that
philosophies of history.
Yeah.
Okay, but all that to come back to kind of in short, of course, both go together. So the challenges are greater, but if you can overcome the challenges, you are much more powerful and much more better, more immune, more protected, more knowledgeable, more faithful than someone who did not go through something as difficult as you're going through in the past.
Yeah.
And our religion says that point blank. Right? Let's stop here. وصلى الله على سيدنا محمد وعلى آله الطيبين الطاهرين.